Writers Forum on May 7, 1974, novelist and poet Ishmael Reed talked about other writers who criticized the use of what they called nostalgia. He believed their remarks amounted to a sideways means of having contempt for the American past. This, he asserted, was done primarily by those who don't think that past worthy of being treated as serious art. It's a sentiment he would, in a way, echo years later when he said school children, especially African American kids, should be given books that don't just reflect the negative aspects of the African American experience. Essentially, there's more to a people than simply their suffering. However, a culture is the byproduct of historical experience. Denying it risks losing a creative influence which makes something not only wholly unique, but honest. Obviously, the past isn't always pretty, but neither is it an endless nightmare. What Reed seems to be getting at is a notion of perspective, that we can juxtapose the darkness against the light, not simply to harvest thin silver linings, but to see how people shine brightest. We tend to think of people growing a glow to fight the darkness, but the truth is sometimes that luster came first. The shadows come afterward, creeping in to snuff out the light. It's important to remember that because it shows how evil reacts to beauty, which is, I think, a theme in Reed's novel Mumbo Jumbo. A work of postmodern fiction, Mumbo Jumbo straddles the line between historical fiction and magical realism. Surreal elements bring the unreal into play, allowing Reed to satirize a variety of individuals and ideologies. For example, the idiocy of racists is easily highlighted by certain events, yet though their bigotry is made somewhat comical, after the laughter a real point lingers. Because the reader can laugh at certain unpleasant topics, it makes it easier to look at them longer and truly absorb the idea on display. In this way, Mumbo Jumbo frequently subverts many points of view. This ranges from historical perspectives to the way people ingest the page. Reed pulls the reader in various directions, offering not just words but art, photos, and variations on text. The story isn't told in the format most people associate with novels. A linear thread of sentences leading the reader to the end may be what most expect. However, in Mumbo Jumbo, those expectations are quickly shattered. From the opening pages, the very layout sparks the realization things are about to be very different. Narrative events take place immediately, then are essentially interrupted by the author's list of works, title page, copyright page, a set of quotes pertaining to the narrative, essentially bringing one back to the story, only to then twist to a dedication page. This conjures a variety of reactions, not least of which is confusion, particularly as to when the story begins, consequently conjuring the fact it started before you even began reading. One may argue all stories begin to some extent in media res, but Mumbo Jumbo takes it a step further, presenting a narrative that is part of a larger historical tapestry. The events which occur are merely a moment in a larger ongoing history. This makes Reed's blending of fact with fiction particularly significant, as the overall story becomes not so much a reflection but an interpretation of history. Given that interpretation is a means to revision, Reed is then able to include a perspective, namely the African American, which Eurocentric Western narratives have left out. Although the novel's structure is an amalgamation of several stylistic elements, Mumbo Jumbo does tell a straightforward story. It's roughly the 1920s in the United States of America. The Harlem Renaissance is happening. Meanwhile, a surreal virus called Just Grew is spreading up from the South, seemingly headed for New York City. An international secret society called the Wallflower Order is trying to stop the spread of Just Grew, which it regards as a malignant disease. Papa Labas, a voodoo practitioner and head of the Mumbo Jumbo Cathedral, believes Just Grew is the delight of the gods. He refers to it as an anti-plague that could free black people from oppression. A side plot involves a group called the Mutafika. This is an organization dedicated to robbing museums in order to return artifacts to their countries of origin, the intention being that by reclaiming their cultural history, those colonized and pillaged by imperialists will regain an enthusiasm for their cultural identity that may motivate them to any variety of aspirations, independence, civil rights, etc. The main plot, however, involves various attempts to control Just Grew. Papa Labas hopes to reunite the anti-plague with its sacred text, the Book of Thoth, which the surreal virus seems drawn to as well as emanating from. The Wallflower Order, meanwhile, does everything to stop the spread, including instigate the U.S. occupation of Haiti, poisoning President Harding, and even attempting to build a talking android, a light-skinned African American who will denounce black culture, encouraging other African Americans to embrace a white Eurocentric view of the world. More than anything else, the Wallflower Order wants to stop dancing and jazz. Remember, these people aren't just racists, they're idiots, regardless of how redundant that may seem. One of the book's best aspects is that magic is alive in Mumbo Jumbo. Voodoo spirits exist and art is treated almost as an extension of the mystical. As such, Papalabas sometimes speaks like a poet, yet elements of the real world blend seamlessly with the magical realism of Reed's novel. He then interweaves historical and fictional elements into the narrative, blurring the line between fantasy and reality. At times, this makes the case the two are not far apart. The character Black Herman, also known as Benjamin Rucker, is an ally of Papalabas. He isn't based on, but is in fact, a famous African-American stage magician. In the novel, Benjamin Rucker is essentially a real wizard who uses his occult knowledge and mystical prowess to perform an exorcism. This blend of history with fiction obscures where one ends and the other begins, but it also relates back to the notion one influences the other. Why conjure a fictional character based on a historical individual when the real person is just as good? Their actions in the story may be fictive, but their reality lends a weight to the narrative. The story, in a way, becomes less fiction and closer to reality. Now, imagine for a moment reading the novel Mumbo Jumbo, then sometime later stumbling across the reality that one of its characters existed. It gives the overall narrative a new facet. Granted, there are those who might say that simply reveals a reader's ignorance regarding African American cultural figures. However, I'd argue that Mumbo Jumbo's use of such individuals compels a reader to confront their ignorance in a way that inspires them to eliminate it. The fascinating portrayals make one thirsty for more. Plus, truth is often more interesting than fiction. Furthermore, if certain characters like Black Herman are in fact real people, what else has the reader been missing out on? It's this idea that something is missing that Mumbo Jumbo excels at. To explain why those things are missing, Reed's book puts forward points of view other than Western. Regarded as a work of Afrofuturism, the novel allows more expression of black subjectivity. In this way, it's almost an alternative history, showing a reader the past from a different perspective. This altered point of view helps enliven symbolic aspects found throughout the book. Certain symbols are relatively obvious. Just Grew is certainly a stand-in for African American art, particularly musical movements such as ragtime and jazz, and their influence on as well as appropriation by white society. The Wallflower conspirators, their reaction to this spread, are clear analogues for a variety of racist movements. I would even argue there's an implication of them as a guiding hand behind more prominent bigoted orders, racism's puppeteer, if you will. Yet a racial agenda isn't the sole goal of the Wallflower Order. Their ambition, ultimately, is control. Their leader, Hinkle von Vemten, wants to control the social narrative. This, in turn, defines the hierarchy of society as well as its beliefs. Papalabas defies this view by putting forward notions expounded by African-American thinkers such as Marcus Garvey. Among those notions are ideas such as biblical figures, Jesus, Moses, and Mary, being black. As Garvey once put forth, whilst God has no color, it is human to see everything through one's own spectacles. And since the white people have seen their God through white spectacles, we have only now started out, late though it be, to see our God through our own spectacles. Again, it's a matter of perspective. Whoever controls it dictates the nature of reality, hence the talking android the Wallflower Order wants to build. It's described at one point as a new kind of robot. The terminology is specific, given that robot originates from the Czech word robota, meaning forced labor. Robots are, in essence, intended as a kind of slave labor. What's more, a robot's place in society is fixed at the lowest possible tier. As Carol Anderson put forward in her nonfiction book, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, black advancement has always been the trigger for white hostility. It isn't simply that African Americans exist which bothers racists. As she wrote, their issue is blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. Racist myths are then intentionally cultivated by those in the upper echelons of society to fuel hostility. Essentially, those at the top of the pyramid are pitting those at the bottom against one another to keep them from fighting the people actually holding them down. Racism is a means to distract poverty-stricken white folks from the idea the rich bosses are the real villains. Myths about African American inferiority even foster an ease in those society might regard as white trash because they create a false sense of superiority. You may be poor white trash, but at least you're not black. Please, for the love of God, don't play that line out of context. But any notions of African Americans possessing a lesser culture are eviscerated throughout Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo. It's not so much that every black character is an intellectual sophisticate, magical dynamo, or savior of the people. Rather, they all possess an undeniable human dignity. Reed doesn't try to make anyone anything other than human. Even the heroes of the story have flaws. In addition, the culture he shows isn't monolithic. It is, in fact, an array of perspectives which coalesce into a larger notion of Afrocentrism, microdiversity within a larger portrait composing a broad view. Think of it like pointillism, a neo-impressionist technique where tiny dots blend into a distinct image. We have the militant Abdul Sufi Hamed, the spiritual awakenings of Earlene, and a notable variety of real-life figures, Claude McKay, A'Lelia Walker, and W.E.B. Du Bois, to name a few. More importantly, it presents a spectrum of African-American perspectives on the world. Artist Kerry James Marshall remarked in the documentary Black Art in the Absence of Light that black as a color possesses a great deal of variation. Often, though, that variety isn't apparent until the colors are presented together. It's only then the variants become obvious. Reed allows the reader to experience those variants, yet his point is even grander. He saw parallels between the 1920s and the 1960s, identities, creativity, and social movements mirroring one another across time: jazz, funk, black power, civil rights, and the Harlem Renaissance. Papa Labus at one point expresses a sentiment suggesting time is a pendulum, not a river. As such, what Ishmael Reed does is reinterpret the past through an Afrofuturist lens, thereby revising history. The past then becomes a part of the present as the pendulum swings back. What it ultimately comes down to is that Mumbo Jumbo puts forward a notion that people are the product of their history. From this comes their culture, which is expressed through art. That expression then possesses the ability to influence other people. Exposure to that art inspires new perspectives, which above all else humanize people who have been denigrated for the purposes of subjugation. We see humanity in cultural expression that makes it harder, if not impossible, to mistreat others callously. Moreover, these examples of art are often displays of happiness, so profound they move people at their core. In the case of Just Grew, those touched by the anti-plague laugh, dance, and lust for life. While it may seem strange anyone would want to stop that, the reality, unfortunately proven by the past and present, is that some see happiness as unsettling. There's always a wallflower order attempting to dictate the lives of others, yet there's a way to resist them. Simply catch that virus called Just Grew, then help the plague spread.